I'll say again, good morning, everyone. How are we all today? Hello there. First, I'll start by acknowledging this land that we meet on today as the traditional lands for Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. We also pay respects to the cultural authority of Aboriginal people attending from other areas of South Australia present here. So thank you for coming in today. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Ben Flink. I'm the Senior Manager for Innovation at the RAA, and it is with special excitement that I am very pleased to welcome Professor Genevieve Bell to present on managing the machines, breakfast in collaboration between RAA and with the new Venture Institute from Flinders University. So Genevieve is a Senior Fellow at Intel, an anthropologist and researcher with more than 15 years of experience driving innovation in the high-tech industry. And as Director of User Interaction and Experience in Intel Labs, Professor Bell led a research team of social scientists, interaction designers, human factors engineers, and computer scientists. She has a swag of accolades to her name as one of Fast Company's inaugural 100 Most Creative People in Business in 2010, and having been inducted into the Women in Technology International Hall of Fame in 2012, and having received the 2013 Women of Vision for Leadership Award by the Anita Borg Institute. She is widely published and holds 13 patents, and she's also this year's ABC Boyer Lecturer, which is fantastic. Also, I just want to say, Genevieve, welcome back to South Australia. I know you love coming here, and please join me in welcoming Genevieve to the stage.
Thank you, Ben. For those of you who knew me in my Thinkers in Residence program, this is living proof that you have a life after being a thinker. One of the things Australians always said to me was, when you're done thinking, what will you be? Will you be an ex-thinker? I'm like, yes, I will be, but I'll come back to South Australia frequently. So I'm incredibly excited to be back in South Australia. I'm also really happy to be back on Kaurna country, so I too want to acknowledge that I'm getting to stand on Aboriginal country. I also want to reflect on the fact that having spent 30 years in the US, it's really nice to come home and get to acknowledge that we're on Aboriginal country. It's not something Americans do, and I find it an increasingly special ritual to get to be a part of, and to get to actually be here is always part of that. When Ben asked me to come and talk here, I did have a brief moment of going, the Royal Automobile Association would like me to talk. Cool, I like cars, I'm all up for that. And I was like, what exactly do you want me to talk about, Ben? He's like, could you come and talk about the future? I'm like, yes, I could do that. I can. So I'm going to take advantage of this to talk a little bit about where my current headspace is at. So this is not a talk that predicts the future. So if you wanted to hear about blockchain, autonomous vehicles, and fill in the blank latest technology, I'm really sorry. It's going to be a tremendous disappointment of a talk to you. Instead, what I want to do is give a bit of a context about where I think the future is going and how we might want to talk about it and what we might want to have as institutional responses to all of that. So lots of ways to think about that, but I want to frame it in terms of what is our relationship to machinery and technology, and how we as humans sit inside that conversation and how we might want to think about it differently. So there's lots of ways to introduce myself. Ben just gave you my scary corporate bio, you know, the one that suggests I was a busy bunny in America, and that's a fair cop. But I'm also a number of other things. I'm a cultural anthropologist by training and predisposition. So I hold a PhD in cultural anthropology from Stanford University. My background was in Native American studies, feminist and queer theory. So you can see how it's an obvious jump from there to the American tech field. Yeah, the short answer is I met a man in a bar in Palo Alto and he led me astray, straight into a tech job. It's really how he led me astray. But I'm also the child of an anthropologist, so I'm lucky enough to have grown up on my mother's field sites in Central and Northern Australia and passingly in Indonesia in the 1970s and 1980s. So I spent my time not far from here with people who were freshly on their settlements and who had a very different understanding of Australia than the one I was raised with. And it was an extraordinary childhood. It was profoundly feral. I spent most of my time without shoes. I got to kill a lot of things and eat them. I always have to hasten to add because it makes me sound like a psychopath otherwise. And it's a really long way from there to Silicon Valley. And I was lucky enough to get myself to the US for education, got myself to Stanford, and Stanford was in the middle of Silicon Valley, so Silicon Valley was in some ways an obvious jump, but in other ways profoundly not. I was the first anthropologist Intel hired. It was part of a moment they were having in the late 1990s when they realized the technology they were building no longer went to the places they recognized, i.e. it stopped going to offices and started going home, and they thought they might want to understand what that would look like. And so there was a wave of hiring research social scientists as a way of saying, if we could understand what people cared about, what frustrated them, what motivated them, could we use those things to drive the next generation of technology innovation? It's not just solving hard technical problems, but actually solving relevant technical problems. Now, of course, that makes Intel sound great, but let's be clear, there were 60,000 people and one anthropologist. So it was a balancing act. There were still 599,000 engineers and me. And when I turned up on my first day at the office, my new boss sat me down and said, we're very excited to have an anthropologist. We don't really understand what you do, but we have 2 tasks for you, which is good. A job description always helps. Okay, what are those 2 tasks? My new boss says, we need help with women. You're like, yeah, okay, don't we all? I'm like, okay, which women? Because specificity helps. And my new boss says, all women. Like all 3.2 billion? I said helpfully. And she said, yes, it would be great. And I'm like, okay, what do you want me to do with 3.2 billion women? And she said, it would be excellent if you could tell us what they want. I'm like, okay. Like Freud. Like, I've got a long list here, but all right. So in my notebook, I write down women all. And underline all. And think, what is the project I will do to help explain women to a silicon manufacturing company? That seemed like a good gig. Like, it's a nice task to have, right? Okay, cool. As a researcher, that's an excellent problem. Until I realized that this boss had said there were 2 things. And if number 1 thing they'd like you to explain is women, it is alarming to imagine what the number 2 thing might be. And I suspect I secretly hoped it would be men, because then, like, could you just explain people's not a bad roving brief? But no, my new boss says, and I have to hasten to add here, it was 1998. She says, we have an ROW problem at Intel. And I'm like, yeah, me too, I don't know what that stands for. I'm like, so what's the acronym? And she says, oh, rest of world. And I'm like, uh-oh. Where's world such that you have a phenomena you describe as rest of world? And she says, oh, that's America, and we have a rest of world problem. I'm like, yeah, I can see what that is. And she's like, that's excellent, because we need help explaining it. I'm like, oh, good. And she's like, and we're very excited, because you come from there. Heard Australia described a lot of things in my life, rest of world, not usually one of them. So I'm like, okay, good. So I looked at this job description, women, rest of world. And I thought, okay, so basically my job is explain everyone who isn't in the building to everyone who is in the building. And I thought, that's a good gig. I can keep that for a while. Or I'm going to go mad in the first 6 weeks because I have to spend my time explaining why you cannot classify the world into rest of world and world. And then I would go to meetings and people would say to me things like, India is the new China. I'm like, what? I started helpfully saying things like, Brazil is the new Russia. And they're like, is that true? Could be. Like, don't really know, but I'll see what happens next. So it was an interesting gig, as you can imagine. I mean, it basically became a job about how do you do what we would now think of as design thinking, human-centered design, human-led design, participatory design, collaborative co-creation. I mean, all the things that we now think about as not quite normal, but increasingly mainstream in the business. That's what this work was, right? It was basically how did you put people into a conversation in a technology company where what they were used to talking about was what the technology did technically, not why people used it, and not what were people's barriers to adoption, what were the things that frustrated people, and what were people's aspirations. That was a very new conversation, frankly, to be having in any tech company, let alone in some ways the most conservative of them. So that was an 18-year career. About 2 years ago, the ANU approached me. They had a new vice chancellor. They were interested in reinvigorating their mission as a national university. So the Australian National University is our only national university established by federal law in 1947 with a mission to create intellectual competency for the nation. Not a bad charter, really. And when Brian Schmidt took over the ANU, he was really interested in kind of reinvigorating that national mission. And to do that, he figured he needed 2 things. One was some different kinds of people, and the second was an identification of some different kinds of problems, and he thought those probably went hand in hand. And so he came to me and said, you need to come home. And I said no, because it wasn't a very good offer. Not in any sense other than it just, you should come home is never a particularly compelling thing. It makes you sound like your parents and you think, no, not coming home for you, thank you. Could you give me a reason? And ultimately he came to me again and said, I think we're at a moment where what the ANU was founded on was a series of critical questions about what the world looked like in 1947 for Australia. And in 1947, that was everyone else has a bomb and we don't. Post-war reconstruction may require people who weren't trained by Friedman and Keyes in the LSE. Maybe we need our own, well, not Friedman, he wasn't around then yet, but we need our own economists. This whole Japan, Asia, Pacific thing, that was a bit unexpected during the war. We might need to understand it better. Oh, by the way, we have some colonies there we should administer. Oh, shit. There was a bit that went, yeah, so medicine, we probably should have a point of view about that. We might need to build our own. And, you know, then to the credit of the current Prime Minister, he said the only reason to fight wars is because you have things you care about. Those things are cultural things. We probably need the arts. And a university was built around those portfolios. There was a physics department. There was a school of the Asia and the Pacific. There was the only Bauhaus arts institution in the Southern Hemisphere. There was a school of economics and governance and a medical school. A reasonable assertion of what a national university should look like given those problems. Circa 2017, it's probably reasonable to assert, as Australians and in the globe, we have a different set of challenges. Not all of those have been eclipsed, but there are new ones that we need to be thinking about and contending with that run the gamut from how do we think about the environment, sustainability, and the critical challenges that face us in a place that continues to be on the edge of the world and that continues to, in some ways, be the lead vehicle for what climate change may or may not look like. So thinking about the environment, clearly a critical set of questions there. For the Vice-Chancellor, he has an appropriate interest, I think, in what it means to really tackle what Australia would look like if we did the right thing around Indigenous issues. And he would reasonably say we've spent a lot of time and energy and the situation doesn't look that different than it looked 40 years ago, so what would new thinking in that space look like? And he looks at the world and says, we are building an increasingly technologically sophisticated world in which we are increasingly in the middle of the machinery. What does it mean to think about engineering in the 21st century against that backdrop? And that's not about, do we need more STEM? It's about what is the nature of an engineering conversation in the 21st century. So that's a much better story if you want to say to me, now come home. And that's the story he told me and said, now come home. And I went, yeah, okay. And so I came home to help with that notion of what would it look like to build an engineering tradition for the 21st century. And that's actually what I want to kind of reflect on a little bit here. But, you know, because Mark is here and he always likes it when I say this, I do realise that having spent 30 years overseas, I have come back to Canberra, to the university my mother was trained in, to the university on whose campus I was raised when I wasn't in the Northern Territory. I'm living in the suburb I grew up in, within line of sight of my primary school, my high school, and the place I finished high school, and it is basically one monumental fang around the block. But it's not something I get to say in America because no one knows what fang is in that context, despite the fact it's in Mad Max Fury Road. And I kid, and they all miss that little line. I'm like, oh, she said fang around the block. All right. So the best way I can think about anchoring a conversation about what it would take to reimagine engineering is with this graph. And I'm making this a straw person, quite consciously. It's not as bad as I'm about to suggest this graph is. So this image was published by the World Economic Forum in 2016. It is their attempt to give a classificatory schema to talk about the current world we're in, but to locate it in a historical genealogy. This genealogy is useful because it talks about what has happened with technology over the last 250 years. It basically breaks them up into 4 periodicities, and we would recognize them. If you actually went to school and paid any attention in history at any point, or you've ever watched television or a movie, these stories are not unfamiliar to you. 4 things happened in the last 250 years that kind of matter, right? There's the beginning of the Industrial Revolution with steam engines. Think, you know, basically dark satanic mills and the tyranny of machinery. We know what that one is. There's the second wave, which is clearly about, you know, Fordism, Taylorism, mass production. Think, you know, Charlie Chaplin's endless, you know, fun and mocking of production lines and, you know, Ford manufacturing. You know, we know what that second wave is. Third wave is clearly about the introduction of computers. So we're not talking about the internet, we're talking about that much earlier generation where things became computerized, when computers stopped being people and started to become machinery, and you scale automation in that process. And then for the World Economic Forum, and frankly I think more globally, we're now, they say, entering this fourth age that they call the cyber-physical system age. You would recognize this because it is characterized by things like conversations around artificial intelligence, autonomous machinery, the automation of processes, deep learning, machine learning, that all kind of sits over on that side here. But one of the reasons this is a useful object is that it makes everything look really clean and tidy. And it has one delightful thing missing. Any guesses? People, that's right. There's no people in this graph, and there's no sense of what the social or human consequences might have been of any of those things, or the institutional responses by human beings, or the unintended consequences of any of that stuff, or frankly, what actually was happening here. Because each one of these is in some ways tagged on a piece of machinery, and the reality was each one of these waves of industrialization wasn't about an individual piece of machinery per se. It was about what happened as those machineries became whole systems. So when you look at that first wave, yeah, okay. What really drives the first wave of industrialization? It's the steam engine, but it's not the steam engine as steam engine. You stuck a steam engine in the middle of the world and went, go. Not much happens. It's not until you connect it to other things and it gets embedded inside broader systems that power mills and trains and waterworks that you actually start to see transformation. It's not the piece of technology itself, it's the system it gets built into. And in each one of these instances, the technologies are the signals, but the transformation isn't the individual piece of technology, it's what it got, basically what got done with it. Like how did people start using it to do things? The reality is also that as each one of these pieces of technology went from being steam engine to train to railway to transportation system, it turned out that as countries and cultures and institutions, we needed different human beings in the conversation. The guys that were good at making steam engines, who thought about metal under heat and pressure, were not the same people you wanted running a railway. They weren't the same people who were going to invent Greenwich Meridian time to make train timetables work. You sure as hell didn't want them selling you a train ticket, and you probably didn't want them designing the interior of the train for you, and they weren't the right people to talk about whether the train was going to be safe. They were very good at talking about whether the steam engine would be safe. And somewhere along the way, the people that can build the individual pieces turn out not to be the people who can talk about the whole. But as human societies, as cultures, we need people who can think about the whole, because those turn out to be the critical problems. The building of it is important, the managing of it is the crucial piece. And institutionally, there are really interesting moments in time where that emerges. So I'm just going to step you through when I think those moments happen and what happens in those moments, because I think it's really an interesting way to talk about where we're at now. And I need to put my cards on the table here. I'm not someone who believes that history gives you the answers. I just think it gives you better questions. And it gives you some places to go looking for what the questions might be and where you might find some of the unexpected protagonists. So if you just take that first wave, first wave of industrialization, that really was about this moment for the very first time when big pieces of mechanization, things that were a little bit automatic, started to become systems. Humans were still managing them. It still required us to manage those systems. But it was a very different way of thinking about the world than we had seen before, and it happens at scale, right? But the first time anyone decides that you need to approach this in a systematic way is unexpected. So the first engineers, people we would recognize as engineers, actually come from France. The first school of engineering was established in Paris in 1794. It was a place called the Ecole Polytechnique, and it was born in the middle of the Reign of Terror in Paris. So in the beginning of 1793, in the midst of the French Revolution, the French killed the King of France. Oops. Turns out one of the things that happens when you kill the king and you go on a fairly significant moment of what we might now call cultural transformation, there are some interesting things that happen. There is a decentering of the church, there is a de-Christianizing of the calendar, there is a transformation in how information is being circulated and what that information looks like. There is a complete overhaul of the role of the regions versus the center and about how goods and services move between them, where the priests had been the gatekeepers. They are now fundamentally removed, as is the aristocracy. And on the one hand, that is the backbone of the French Revolution. How do we establish government for the people, by the people? What are the means by which you would do that? One of the challenges that arises, however, in so doing is that there are now a whole series of systems that need to be managed, and the way they had been managed up until that moment was by fiat and privilege. And for the Revolutionary Army and for Napoleon's troops, they realized that that's not sustainable. And as part of this period of great instability from 1793 to 1795, one of the things they do is establish this first school that will train effectively the generation of men that will run France. They call it the Ecole Polytechnique. It is characterized by a combination of hands-on learning and theory. They bring together all of what we'd now think of, what we would now call physical sciences. In those days, we called natural sciences. So mathematicians, geologists, chemists, physicists, as well as philosophers, logicians, people who specialized in literature. And the idea was to create a cohort of people who knew how to think about the world scientifically and as rational thinkers, and who could manage whole systems. And so the Ecole Polytechnique built engineers. Those engineers were designed to manage these very systems. What's fascinating here to contemplate is that in 1794, being an engineer was radical. That was a radical act. It was an established thing. It was a human notion that we were going to build something that looked different than what had come before. It's an institutional response driven by an emerging democracy about what it would mean to create what we would now know as technocrats, but basically to create a cohort of people who knew how to think about these systems as systems, who understood the component pieces, but were also thinking about the logic that they would impose. So the Ecole Polytechnique is one tradition, it's one set of responses. Across the Channel, it looks completely different. In Britain, there is no university to teach engineers. The first courses in engineering aren't actually offered formally until the 20th century in England. If you wanted to be an engineer in Britain, you had to go work for an engineering firm. So you went and worked for a company that built the engines or the tools or some combination of both. And they were run by people like Brunel and Smeaton and Maudsley. You went and you apprenticed in one of those companies. You learned all of their tools and all of their machinery. You became a Smeaton boy or a Maudsley boy. And then at some point, if you wanted to practice, you had to go and get certified. In 1821, the Association, or the Society for Civil Engineers, gets founded in Britain by Smeaton, Maudsley, and Brunel, and a few others, to basically give a little bit of cross-pollination. And you have to come present yourself to that body to be certified as an engineer. And the way it worked in Britain was you couldn't work on a project unless you had that certification and you had one of those trainings. So it was effectively an apprenticeship project. And that system carries through well into the 20th century. There are Australians that I know who went to Britain in the 1950s to get certified as engineers by the civil society and would have to go to England, present their qualifications, spend 6 months there getting a little bit of, gloss on them before they could come back here and practice. So two very different traditions, right? But all in the same notion that we needed a different set of skills in order to manage the machinery than the skills that had existed before. But the notion here was, again, about how do humans stay in control of the system? How do you think about that locus of activity? In Australia, the first school of engineering is actually early, and it's based on the Ecole Polytechnique system. It was at the University of Melbourne. Its focus was around mining, and it was established in 1861. So we're actually quite early in terms of schools of engineering here, and we were always a weird hybrid between the French notion of an Ecole Polytechnique and the notion that even if you were certified that way, you still had to go to England. So, the best or worst of both worlds, depending on how you kind of look at it, right? So engineering as this forced knowledge domain, basically, it's an applied science, and it gets built and curated very deliberately. The next one, if you remember that World Economic Forum chart, suggests that that second wave of industrialization is about automation, electrification, and mass production. And that's absolutely the case. What's interesting is that the most important and significant institutional response to that is not actually about the machinery per se, it's about what the machinery produces. And one of the things you can argue that comes out of that is more capital than anyone had ever been able to think about, and people suddenly wealthy at a scale that is unimaginable. One of those people was a man named Joseph Wharton, who was a Philadelphia industrialist, who found himself by the early 1880s swimming in money he didn't know what to do with and he couldn't work out how to manage, because he actually owned pieces of companies, he owned the beginnings of shares in companies, he was a part owner in companies, and it was a move that was starting to happen across the east coast of the United States. People were no longer making their money just by building things. They were now investing in other people building things, and that was increasingly weird. And their bookkeepers didn't know what to do with it, because they just couldn't keep a kind of, this was not a good dual entry bookkeeping strategy. And so Joseph Wharton comes to the president of an American university and basically says, I'll give you $100,000 if you can build me a better bookkeeper. And the president of the University of Pennsylvania is a sensible man and says, I will take your money, but I don't think you need a better bookkeeper. And by reference, that's about 3 million US. It's about, 375 Australian, about that same time, million, so not chump change. And the president of Pennsylvania goes, I don't think this is about bookkeeping. I think this is about the invention of a new way of thinking about money. And in fact, a new way of thinking about money at scale, where the individual pieces don't work anymore. And he says, I think we're going to need a different kind of thing. This isn't about better accountants. And so he pulls together the economists he has there who are starting to think about economic systems. He brings together some early behavioral psychologists who were actually on staff then, interestingly enough. He brings in some people out of law, philosophy. Should start to sound familiar. Philosophy is always the answer, no matter what the question, it turns out. He also brings together, the bookkeepers, because he figures they probably need to be in the loop. And they set about building out a curriculum. And we, of course, know this, because this is the Wharton School of Business. But at the time, it was a new and novel thing. Out of that first school in Pennsylvania was created a series of tools we now think about. So the GDP was invented at Wharton as a measure of economic health. It was the first place to theorize labor relations. It had the first place to actually articulate a theory about a brand, and the very first market research was actually done by graduates of that school at a place called Curtis Research in Philadelphia. They were the first people to think about how did you build logos and brands. And they effectively created an entire new way of thinking about managing capital and capitalism. And you can have your arguments with whether MBAs are useful or not useful qualifications. What is interesting here is that an entire new body of thought was built on top of an emerging system. And what's getting managed here isn't the machines per se, but the consequences of mass production. Was that, in a Marxist sense, it really did profoundly alienate workers from their labor, and it created the circulation of unimaginable wealth. And so what you have here is industry coming to universities and going, help, could you help? So first school is at Wharton, second school is the Haas School at Berkeley, then follows one at Harvard, a few other places around the traps. Australia doesn't get its first business school to the 1950s. So we're quite late to that, which when you think in some ways about how wealth has been generated in Australia is probably not surprising. This wasn't, a place where automation happened en masse and where capital has been amassed en masse. And some of the strategies here just didn't make sense, and it takes much longer to get traction. And it's the University of Sydney, I think about 1955. Third wave, so think back to that graph, right? Computers. So the history of computing is a fun one, but there's this moment in the late 1940s when computers stop being basically women who do maths and become electronic calculators and then increasingly complicated machinery. First wave of computers aren't that sophisticated, the ENIAC in Australia, CIRAC and CILIAC. They were stored memory programming computers, but basically they could add up, subtract, multiply, and divide. They were effectively not much better than the calculator on your phone, but they took up a room this big and required the electricity of 6 suburbs. So, not a good trade-off. And they were expensive and hard to run. But by the 1950s and 1960s, IBM, RAND, GE, Honeywell were producing computers at a fair number, mostly in the United States. They were predominantly sold to companies and government. They were running payroll, doing the census, doing taxes, starting to calculate things like supply chain management, traffic loads. In Australia, they were doing things like calculating mortgage rates, rain forecasts, winning the Melbourne Cup, and the My Music Bowls, dimensionality, right? So the sort of things you'd imagine with big numbers. What was happening, however, was that attached to each one of those companies, as those computers got more sophisticated, they were no longer just doing one function. They could now do multiple functions. They required programs. But each one of the programs that was built for one of these computers went with a particular company. So IBM had Fortran. GE and RAND had Flowmatic, which became COBOL. Honeywell had something else. So each program was associated with a particular machine and a particular company. And for some unexpected moments in the early 1960s, the United States government looked across their supply chain and went, basically, shit, we're buying a lot of computers and we seem to be buying them from one company and we don't have anyone who knows how to do this Fortran thing. They keep sending us Fortran people, so in order to make their machines work, we also have to buy their programmers. And, is that like a critical kind of point of failure in our computational world? Is that the machines come with a program and no one else knows it except the people who have the machines? Does that make us intensely vulnerable? And someone inside one bit of the American government went, uh-oh, yeah, that might actually, so what are we going to do about it? And so bits of the United States government approached a mathematician at my old alma mater at Stanford and said to him basically, what would it take to create a cadre of people who knew how to manage across all these different platforms and were thinking about programming as an application space rather than a particular discrete object? And this mathematician went, yeah, we could do that. They went, good, could you get on with it then? So you get a bit of NSF funding, basically National Science Foundation funding. This mathematician brings together 30 of his buddies from around the US, and they spend 2 summers where they workshop out what basically a curriculum would look like. They build out what they think all the building blocks are. Again, they go looking for mathematicians, linguists. Linguists are good in early forms of computation. Wait for it. Philosophers, because they do logic and rhetoric. And they build out what the baseline of a curriculum should be. And in 1968, in December, at the Association for Computer Machinery's annual conferences, George Forsyth, who was the mathematician at Stanford, turns up with the curriculum document, gives it to everyone who was there, and says, here is computer science, go teach it. And astonishingly, everyone there says, that's great, George, thanks. And they take it home and teach it. And it gets implemented in multiple mathematics and physics departments around the United States. Computer science gets offered first as a basically small concentration and eventually stands up as schools in most of those places. So starting at Stanford, Purdue, Oxford, a few other places around the traps. And computer science has been thus ever since. So if you were not raised as a computer science and you were taught in any other discipline than that, you will find that story as implausible as I do. At least as anthropologists, the notion that you could turn up at some annual meeting and go, here's the curriculum, you should teach it in every school around the country, you would be greeted by anthropologists going, yeah, nah, that's not happening. Who are you? We don't even agree with the person in the department, let alone you, I don't know you. You could just take your curriculum and go away. Whereas in computer science, they go, that's great, when's the next one due out? And they update it every 2 years and on they move, which is an extraordinary thing. I know, it's magical and mystical and I don't quite know what to do with it. But it created computer science, right? In Australia, actually, the very first departments are the University of Melbourne and here at Adelaide. Adelaide continues to be one of the real centres for computing in the globe. It's actually an early Turing site, and a couple of the most important roboticists on the planet come from here. So it's got an interesting history here, partly because of the long propensity towards mathematics in the university system here. So 3 moments in time where you have institutional responses triggered by very different things to manage the machinery, basically. And what it's all about is this notion of what happens when it stops being individual pieces and becomes a system, and when the challenge is about complexity, and not just managing complexity, it's about how do you manage it safely. Where safety is clearly very different things. Safety is a government doesn't want to be held hostage to a single supplier. People are worried that the trains keep blowing up and falling off the tracks. There's some vague concern about where's all that money going. So multiple different kind of triggers about what the managing the complexity should look like, and multiple different responses as to what it should be. But each one of those waves of industrialization effectively created the appearance of a new domain of knowledge, a new applied science, if you want to think of it that way. Certainly a new discipline appeared, a new practitioners appeared. Didn't stop the old ones from being there. The electrical engineers didn't go away because computer scientists turned up. Computer scientists have not put MBAs out of business. Maybe they should, but they haven't. So we know all of that, right? So think about that 4th wave, right? World Economic Forum describes it as cyber-physical systems. So what is it that we imagine is happening there, right? If you think about those 3 previous waves, machinery let us, in that first wave, move faster and exert more power on the world than we had, using steam to create basically machines that could do things at an intensity we couldn't. The second wave let us do it at a scale. we couldn't. So machinery let us do things faster and more of it for less energy. That third wave is similar, right? It doesn't just augment our bodies, it augments our brains, but we're still effectively in control. At each one of those previous waves, it's been humans controlling the machines using some new mechanism. Steam, programs, punch cards, power, whatever the thing is, right? This next wave feels very different. And I think it's an interesting question about whether this is about us managing the machines or about a complete flip in that locus of where the sort of management sits. So when I think about what is that cyber-physical system about, I think it's about data. But I think what's interesting here is that we're at a moment in time where what the preponderance of data lets you have happen, by which I mean everything from the data that's generated by everything you type into your phone to whatever is on your body to whatever pieces of information are being collected in this building, in this city. So think Internet of Things, think all the passive tracking that's already in your car, in your house, in our country. That's a tremendous amount of data. What that data allows to have happen effectively is that the machinery can now manage itself. That in fact what has happened here is this is no longer about us controlling the machines, it's about the machines being able to use data to drive the machines. I don't want to use the language itself because I don't want to impose consciousness on this machinery, and it's quite hard to work out how to have that conversation without giving the machinery a self. So I'm going to struggle through this because I still haven't found a linguistic way of talking about this. But imagine what we are suggesting here is that we are moving into a phrase where the automation can be automated, where the automation no longer needs a command and control infrastructure with us in the loop. That in fact what happens here, which is what artificial intelligence is about, it's what machine learning is about. Every time someone tells you about an algorithm, all an algorithm is a way to make a machine do a series of tasks. It's using patterns to suggest that if A, then B, then C. That's all an algorithm is. It just automates a machine to do something. Now, the critical pieces in that are what's the data, what's the pattern, and what's the machine. But effectively what is happening here is we are moving from a moment where, as humans, computers responded to us because we told them what to do. Even when you go into Google, there's a white box, you type in something, you're effectively telling a machine to do something. This next wave, that's not going to be what happens. The data makes it possible for the machines to automate without us in the loop. So what does that look like, and how do we start to imagine that world? And what are the pieces, right? If the pieces of the Industrial Revolution were about steam engines and steel and being able to lay down railway tracks and thinking about Greenwich Mean Time, and the money was about, the GDP and a bunch of other things, what's this one about, and what are the pieces? Well, we know what some of the pieces are. It's clear they've already been around for a little while. Whenever we talk about the Internet of Things, so basically the notion that almost any fixed physical object can now be connected to the internet, and it can be a collector of data, a sensing object. It can know where it is. Even the language lets us down. As an object, the object has some sense of where it is and what's going on around it, and it is now real-time and live. So the difference between a light bulb and a smart light bulb is that the smart light bulb is now connected to the internet, is collecting information, and it can do something with that. And then imagine that at scale. So we know that's happening. So at one level, even despite our challenges with the NBN, we are in a place where many things are connected and much data is flowing, just not as fast as in other places on the planet. And my happy colleagues at Telstra assure me they'll fix this. But even if they don't, everywhere else in the world the data is moving, right? So shit is getting smarter, it is connected. And as a result, there is this kind of way where objects now are smart, sensing, data collecting, data receiving things. So the world goes from being inanimate to being animate, not necessarily conscious in any sense we would recognize, but it's now dynamic. Layer on top of that, we now have enough computational power, which we have not had before, to start crunching through that data. Now, at first pass, most of what happens when people talk about machine learning is all that means is they have given a big hunk and pile of data to a machine and said, can you learn anything? It really is as simple as it sounds. And all that machine is doing is looking for patterns in the data. Like, is there anything there that looks like a repetition? Now, of course, we've been doing that forever. That's how code breakers in the the 1900s work, that's, what IBM was doing in Townsville with the code breakers in Australia. Another nice South Australian, Mr. Nave, actually Flight Lieutenant Nave, who was a very odd duck, as all cryptographers are. But, so machine learning is simply about looking for patterns in the data. What gets more interesting is when those patterns are found and whether you can do something with them. So is the pattern meaningful? How do you then trigger action on the basis of it? And is that action appropriate? And most of us in the room have already encountered some version of machine learning. If you use Netflix, again, all caveats about our network notwithstanding. If you use Netflix, if you use ABC's iView, if you go to Google, if you used Commonwealth Bank Net app, if you use probably the RAA, I'm sure has something in their site built in this way. If you use a dating website, it doesn't really matter. Any website you go to that has either a recommendation engine, so it says, hey, you're back. Oh, the last time you were here, you watched this. Here's some other stuff we know you're going to like on the basis of that. That's machine learning. That's simply a tool that said, oh, people who like this also like this. You liked that, so you'll also like this. I mean, it's pretty rudimentary, but it's a pattern, and that's all that's happening. So you've been encountering that stuff for a decade plus. What's here is that it is now getting more sophisticated. It is moving across domains, and it's no longer about finding you your next movie. It's about determining your credit risk. It's about deciding whether you should be insured by your health insurance company. It's about determining whether you are dangerous to the nation state or not. And it's now about multiple sources of data, not just the ones you gave up or volunteered. It's also the case that as this technology unfolds, it's not just about our interactions with the machines, it's about the machines interacting with each other without us. So it's about, not yet in this building, but in buildings like this, in other places in the world, we would be in here, we would all have name tags. Those name tags would be dynamic. The building would know how many of us were in this room at the moment, and it would be adjusting the temperature in this room in real time because of the number of people that were here. Not, as it turns out, taking account of which one of us were women or men, because that would make a difference, but just doing it on root numbers and going, well, this room is wired for 250, we've only got about 125, we're going to reconfigure the way we're doing the temperature. At no point would anyone say to Cindy, hey, Cindy, how are you feeling about the temperature? It would just talk badges to HVAC without us. And what starts to happen in this world is that's what happens, is the machinery is now talking to other bits of machinery, absent us. Now, those conversations wouldn't happen without us deciding those were the conversations that should happen. So the thing about machine learning is we are still the ones usually saying to the machine, here's a bunch of data, can you work out the pattern? But when people talk about deep learning and autonomous software, what they are starting to suggest is that there will be a moment when the machinery will go, well, that looks like an interesting set of data, Sean, that you haven't shown me before. So I don't really care that Sean doesn't want to give me his data. I've just taken his data and I'm going to go have a look and see if there are any patterns in it because, Dan's data might be interesting too and I'm going to go have a look in that. And I may decide as a machine that there are patterns in that, not that you volunteered it to me, and I may decide that action is necessary on the basis of that, without a human immediately in the loop, although the human will have architected the world in which that happens. So, when people talk to you about AI, autonomous machinery, when you hear about self-driving cars, they're all part of this world. They're part of a world where the data lets the machinery be automated without us in the loop. What it takes to imagine what the institutional response to that is quite tricky. This isn't about more computer scientists, this isn't about electrical engineers, this is about a profoundly different set of questions that get triggered, right? And I think it turns on three questions in particular. If we imagine that these systems are now automated automation, and the language we keep using is autonomous, there are some really interesting questions about what we mean by autonomous there, right? The old history of computing suggests that it's individual machines, right? So when you say a self-driving car, you think of one car. You don't think of the fact that that car could be actually part of a flock of cars all just like it that might be talking to each other about road conditions, not talking to you. At the moment, they're being technically built as though they'll be individual objects because the language of compute has been that they are all individual objects, not collected. And the way we use autonomy in having these conversations continues to support that notion, right? But if the machines have automated, you've automated the automation, what does it mean to suggest they're autonomous? And how do we think about that? Most of the metaphors and symbolic ways we have of talking about autonomy inside our human language, when we say things are autonomous, it tends to be co-located with sentience, consciousness. We tend to imagine that certain kinds of human systems, beings, get to be autonomous, limited. Women, yeah, okay, good. You know, we say thank you to the state of South Australia for making sure we got the vote at a national level very quickly because you wanted to be autonomous here. That's good. Go Muriel Matters. But, you know, we know that as humans we have a tendency to imagine that we get to grant autonomy to things, which is already an interesting power structure about what that looks like. And we have notions of some things get to be more autonomous than others. Historically, children are autonomous, sentient beings, but not fully vested. You know, we might say the same about, oh, I don't know, English cricketers. There's all kinds of things we grant limited autonomy to. So, you know, we have that kind of notion, right? But autonomy has all these other ideas that sit inside of it that have technical consequences that we aren't very good at unpacking. There are also tremendous consequences ethically, philosophically, and at law. So if the machine is autonomous, it's automated itself. Who's responsible if something goes wrong? Where is the locus of liability? How do you measure risk? What is the appropriate safeguards you would need to take and how would they be implemented? So the first country to issue guidelines for this, unsurprisingly, is Germany, who have a new set of guidelines out about 5 months ago for autonomous vehicles. They are very clear that the locus of liability for an autonomous vehicle lies with the vehicle manufacturer first and foremost, not the absent driver. That the state is responsible for the infrastructure that make the vehicles possible, and that the vehicles cannot be allowed on the road until the calculus of risk has hit the appropriate dimensionality where the vehicle at its worst is less risky than a human at their best. Interesting trade-off, right? They also then argue that the state is responsible for creating the infrastructure that will make this possible. So, you know, I know there's a lot of talk in Australia at the moment about long-haul fleet vehicles and about automating trucks. There are some interesting constraints about that are ecosystem-wide, not vehicle-specific. So if you want to have an autonomous vehicle, it turns out the autonomous bit does not mean it's not connected to anything. For it to not have a driver in the loop, it needs to have an incredibly robust telecommunications network back-ending it so that data can flow in both directions. Sometimes that can be satellite, but the latency with satellite is high. So actually, how long does it take for the satellite to tell you something and how long does it take to get a response? So latency. And the longer the latency, the harder it is to use satellite for mission critical things. So it's fine to have the satellite tell you it's raining. It's not fine to have the satellite tell you that that rain has created a flood ahead of you and you should stop driving the vehicle or the vehicle should stop itself, right? So think about South Australian roads. You know how quickly they flood. Satellite latency may not get you there. You're going to need a telecommunications network. So we already can see an impediment for certain kinds of self-driving experiments in Australia. Right about Pimba would be my guess. I think that's about where the old CDMA network used to cut in, and it's certainly where 4G cuts out. So just imagine a fleet of trucks parked at Pimba, waiting for the future. Patiently. Having good lamb chops, though. Second problem, of course, is that even if you could solve the telecommunications problem, in order for an autonomous vehicle to function, it needs a clearly defined lane to travel in. So it needs to know it's on a road. I'm willing to bet all of you know what a road is even when it looks nothing like a road, because you drive on them regularly if you drive anywhere, well, north of Jeff's Cross. You've been on something where you go, I know that's the road, but wow, boy, they've really let that kind of go. Or, they've never sealed that road, did they? And you really don't know if that's the turnoff or the road itself. But we know how to kind of intuitively determine those things. For an autonomous vehicle to do that effectively, you actually need to have very clear repeated signals of roadness, roadfulness. Historically, that would be things like a nice white line up the middle, happy little sort of the side guideline things, the white reflectory things that, you know, shimmer. Those tend to fall away as you get further out of population centres. You'd need to fix that with a built infrastructure. Now, you should immediately think about those things and go, so she's telling us in order to have trucks that run themselves, we need fat, fast pipes and well-marked roads. Huh. Who's going to pay for that? If you're a trucking company, that's a really big upfront cost that you're not going to get paid out on the back end for quite some time. That's a CapEx, OpEx trade-off that's not insubstantial. And there are still ongoing technical challenges about how all of that works. And again, it keeps coming back to what is the nature of autonomous? What are the broader systems in which it is embedded? How do you think about trust, liability, and risk? Who built that autonomous vehicle and what sensibility is built into it, and how do we think about that? Large European car companies been testing cars in Australia recently, autonomous ones out just south of Canberra. They had modelled roadside hazards really effectively, so all the stuff that's by the side of the road, because you can program a car to kind of know that bad shit might happen to it. Small children, prams, things you shouldn't run into. In this case, they modelled all of the roadside danger using caribou. Good for cows, dogs, not so good for wombats, but still okay. Good for goats, okay for camels. Monumentally bad, it turns out, for kangaroos, who do this. Boop, boop. And every time they go up, you can see the horizon underneath of them. And so effectively for the autonomous vehicle, they have disappeared. There was a kangaroo, then it was gone. There's a new kangaroo, now it's gone again. Yeah, nothing to look at here. Unsurprisingly, this car just ran into kangaroos. That's all it did for the first 3 days, and no one could work out why. So like, we modelled roadside hazards, it's all good. You're like, yeah, okay, caribou, not kangaroo, as it turns out. Pretty straightforward. So now imagine you are adopting an autonomous system. You, Miles, you're adopting an autonomous system from somewhere else in the world, like pick a country, and you've brought it here. What's lurking inside how it's modelled autonomy that may not make sense here? How do you validate it? How do you test it? How are we going to regulate it? What does it mean as Australians to say, there are some notions inside that object that don't work here, or that we don't like here, or that make no sense here, or that haven't been contended locally? So how we think about autonomousness, quite tricky. Second one here, and I know Ben is like, you have to stop talking now, give me 5 more minutes. Second one you have to think about is agency. So you've decided the object has automated itself. What are the limits on that? So if it's a self-driving vehicle, does it get to go to the edge of the CBD? Does it get to go to Jepp's Cross? Does it get to go to the South Australia NT border? Or does it get to go all the way to Darwin? And who makes those decisions? And where does the negotiation have to come in with a human being? How have you decided what those limits are? And how dynamic are they? And who has oversight in them? And then, oh, by the way, what is the model you are using to determine all of that in the first place? So my colleagues at Google who have been building intelligent travel agents, little tiny bots that, will negotiate plane tickets for you. Totally banal. I mean, it is the most boring thing you've ever seen. So, Antonia has got this travel bot that's negotiating plane tickets on behalf of her and her organisation. And that's great. What she doesn't know is that those travel agents have been trained using 3 different training regimes. One of them was trained in negotiation using chess. One of them was trained in negotiation using Go, so the Chinese strategy game. And one of them was trained in negotiation using Call of Duty, single-person shooter video game. Now, it turns out, if you need to, at the very last minute, get a really cheap ticket, you want the one trained on Call of Duty. No one ever wants to deal with it again after that, though. So now you have a problem. If you are an agency and you have acquired an object that is operating on your behalf, you've automated some process by which you buy the pastry outside or the coffee, or you determine the weather, or whatever the thing is. You have an autonomous object operating on your behalf. It is now an agent for you and your institution. How do you scrutinize the rules of the road that it has internalized? How do you know what it's decided are the mechanisms by which it will operate for you and your institution? What are the limits you put on how it's doing that for you? Back to the autonomous vehicles. Maybe they only go to the South Australian NT border, but, was the agent sitting inside that vehicle registered with the RAA, so they will only let you go at the speed limit? And, oh, by the way, they'd like you to go slower at dusk, and they really think you should stop, rest, and revive every 2 hours, so they turn off the vehicle. That would be an interesting thing that your car did for you. How do you know that? How do you have visibility into that, and what does that look like? And then last but no means least of the set of questions I think that get flagged in this new era is this one about what I'm calling assurance or safety. How do we think about how will we know if these systems are safe? How will we know about risk, security, liability? How will these systems know to make obvious to us what the assumptions are they're making inside, what their tolerances are? How will we decide what the appropriate ways to manage all of this are? And frankly, we've done this for a long time in Australia. We have very clear rules about what we bring into this country, about what we tolerate from pharmaceutical regimes, new technologies, God, even books, not that I want to go back to a censorship regime of the 1950s, but Australia's been very clear about what we think about in terms of how safe or not safe we want things to be. And the protocol at the moment in this area is to build algorithms and just see what happens. And the reality is in some of these places, you don't want to see what happens. We actually can't live in a world where the machinery is working it out in real time with us as its subjects. So thinking about what is the appropriate innovation strategy, when in fact the software methodology for the last 25 years in Silicon Valley, build it in beta, get humans to test it and iterate when they're pissed off, may not work here when some of the very first things that get automated are data-rich, rule-based, stationary tasks. So government policy, medical diagnosis, the law, places where in fact we don't want those to learn on the job. May not be good if it's your pathologist or your judge's clerk or your doctor. So thinking about how it is that we build these systems, test them and introduce them becomes part and parcel of what this next wave looks like. So and it's not good news really. So the only good news I have here, and it's not good news, the only thing I can give you by way of comfort is that's the set of questions I've decided I have to go pursue. And so I have given myself a 5-year runway to go build the next applied science that will be that answer. So hopefully 5 years from now when I'm standing back here again going, you can have a life as a thinker in South Australia still thinking, I will tell you both what this discipline is called and where to send your children to come take it with me. But in the meantime, I know that's where our attention should be, right? And it's easy to get seduced by the stories about the killer robots and, AI is the answer to everything. But the reality is those are pieces of a system that is coming, and that system is complicated and increasingly abstract and doesn't look like the waves that came before it. So whilst you can put it in a story about industrialization, automation, and computerization, it is profoundly different in terms of what it will mean. That doesn't mean there aren't ways we can engage with it and choose to manage it, but it requires a very different set of thinking and tools than we have had previously. So with that really heavy thought, I'm going to send you off into a Wednesday? Tuesday? Tuesday. I'm going to send you off into a Tuesday to go think about how you're going to manage the machinery. And Ben's like, thank God she stopped talking. And I've stopped talking. Good. Thank you. And I won't take it personally if you run for the doors because you have a life.
So I just want to open it up to the floor, and this is a cool little toy that we have. We can throw it at people. It's actually still a microphone. It won't hurt you. Mate, put your drinks
I'm a
away.
little concerned when you say you're just going to throw it at people.
Does anyone have a question to ask Genevieve?
Bearing in mind, if you can't catch, he'll bring it to you. No, I've frightened you all into submission. Oh. G'day, Aaron.
I've got just a question about the sort of lack of diversity and biases in the algorithms. I know it keeps coming up in conversations. Is there anything going on in Australia to kind of look at that and look at the kind of who's writing the rules in these systems that we are importing into Australia? And are we thinking about how we should be examining that?
Good question. So Aaron's question is in some ways about, kind of goes back to that moment I said that one of the challenges with algorithms is it depends what data you feed them to what sense they make of things. So there's been a lot of talk in Silicon Valley over probably the last 2 years about algorithms that are racist, sexist, homophobic, and American. Well, insofar as they see, no, please don't. Thank you very much. Though, if you had to, it's in the Boyer lectures, which I should tell you to go listen to. No, and what I mean by that, right, is when So when Google was building some of its very first early applications of machine learning, so when they basically released various of their computational objects into data sets, they created algorithms that matched things in the world that were complicated. Now, part of the challenge was about the team itself, but most of the challenge was actually about the data sets they used in the first place. So there's 3 really famous examples I can think of. One is that Google used an incredible set of data to build a translation tool. They had access to all of the EU, basically multiple language translation documents. They had access to 100 years of multiple countries' newspapers, and they built what is arguably the most sophisticated translation engine for real-time translation we've ever seen. Now, those of you who speak any other language than English, particularly a language where pronouns are gendered, we know that you can use the gendering of a pronoun or a gendering of a noun to understand that's not always a direct link to the gendering of the object. But in certain languages, we make a difference between a female doctor and a male doctor. In English, we tend to make a difference between a doctor and a female doctor, which is completely different. And what the Google tool did was that it learned by looking at 100 years of translated objects that doctor was always male and that nurse was always female. And so that in languages where it was having to assume a pronoun where they didn't know the pronoun, every time it read the word doctor, it translated it as he. Every time it read the word nurse, it translated it as she. Now, was the problem there that the team that worked on that was 90% male? No, it actually turned out the problem with that was that for the last 100 years, most doctors have been men. And what you would have to do in order to fix that algorithm isn't fix the team per se, it's actually think about whether the data is enough to make the algorithm. Because one of the problems about data is by its very nature, it's retrospective. So data is always what happened before. It is not, in fact, what happened next, because that's not yet data. That's a prediction. So the thing about data is it describes the way the world has been. And frankly, the world has been a pretty not so good place if you were certain categories of people. So in that particular instance, and a number of others like it, the problem was inherently the data source, not the team. Now, the challenge became that the team didn't catch it and go, oi, lots of doctors are girls and certainly should be more of them moving forward. So how do we change this translation tool so that it's either just randomizing and at 50% it asserts that it's female, or just for fun 100% of the time it asserts it's female? I had a philosophy professor who did that. It was great. Every pronoun he ever used was she. It was really disruptive and kind of fab. That's not what they chose to do, obviously. So you've got that as a problem, is the data. That problem with the data actually magnifies in some really interesting ways. So when Google is building an algorithm using machine learning, they take a very big data set, and they've got hundreds of thousands to millions of data pieces. They take 10% of that data set and run their tool on that. And they say, find the pattern. The tool finds the pattern. They then run it across the entire of the data set to see if the pattern is reproduced. So that's a standard and control mechanism, right? So that seems really sensible. You find the pattern in 10%, you find it in 100%, you found a pattern. The challenge is that at no point are you asking yourself, what does the 100% look like versus the world? So Google found themselves in tremendous trouble, and I'm not picking on Google, it's just they've been really early to a lot of this stuff, and to their credit, they've actually done a tremendously good job in working out how to use this to drive conversations internally. But their second one they did was they basically used machine learning to teach computers to identify what was in photos. So if you use any of the photo storage systems on Google, you know you can type in certain words into the search term and it will find you photos that have Christmas trees in them, or cups of coffee in my instance, or Woomera. If you want to go looking for that, it knows how to find Woomera, which is great because it's using meta tagging, not actually the images in the content. But so they did this thing where they taught themselves to label photos. And they did it with a massive photo base of human faces and objects, set it loose, did the 10%, did the 100%. It's great. They let it loose, and the first thing it does is identify black faces as gorillas. Yeah, this was not a good moment. To their credit, they went and pulled it down, and had to go work out why. Now, it turned out what the challenge was twofold. One was that the photo set they were using was not what you would argue is representative of America or the world, because it was user-generated content. And so they had the data that was available to them. Had that data been global data, 70% of the faces in it would have been dark-skinned, maybe 80%. And, the white faces would have been the anomaly, not the other way around. Had they known how to audit that data set and ask, was it representative of the planet or of the phenomena they were tracking, they might have ended up somewhere else. The second order problem was that they didn't have anyone on the team who was African American or dark-skinned to then test it against themselves or anything else. As soon as they found it, they went into immediate course correction mode, and it wasn't because the team was racist. It was a data set. Now, it tells you something about how the data is collected and why that data exists, and those are second and third order problems, right? So in both of those instances, there are a couple of people in the US, a partnership coming out of Boston called AI for Good, Data and Society in New York in particular, and then the Data Justice League, who I totally love, who are coming out of Boston, who are these young data scientists. I know the Data Justice League, and they do have the whole superhero thing and everything. And they're fabulous. And they've been running a really interesting set of basically proof of concepts and challenges looking at what it would mean to make representative data. So how do you have justice in data, which I think is a really interesting question and a lovely formulation, right? Gary Foley and I were talking recently about how do you decolonize data, and I think it's the same sort of piece of the story, right? Of what does it mean to know that your data is flawed, and how do you then think about intervening in it? And as you think about those things, that does become an interesting challenge, right? Of also, at what point do you then want to intervene, and how do you argue for that intervention? So if you were, I don't know, the Australian government at this point, and you decided you were going to get to gender parity for pay inside the public service, you couldn't use existing pay data to get you there. So you couldn't build an algorithm based on the existing pay data, because it would tell you that, in fact, you should keep paying everyone the way you're paying them, because that's the way it's always been. So what's interesting there is machine learning won't help you. AI won't help you. AI would help you moving forward if what you did is said, for every candidate moving forward, we will determine that they all get paid the same, because we've taken humans out of the decision loop, but you can't use the existing data to get you there. So all of those are interesting challenges. Now, on the diversity and inclusion side, there are clear examples from Silicon Valley of monumental fails that are based on not having diverse teams. I mean, the clearest one, and I will beat them up on this one, though I prefer you didn't put it on Twitter, is Apple, who are glorious in many regards, but when they released their software development kit for the Apple Watch, I'm sure some of you have one, hello indeed, Apple Watch sits on your body, it's an early quantified self object, it's close to you, so it's tracking a lot of health stuff. It has calendar, it has heart rate, it's doing fitness stuff. The team built a software development kit, which is basically what you release in advance of the technology in order to build a series of apps that will sit on top of it. There was nothing for tracking menstruation, ovulation, or fertility. Yep, and no, it gets better. No, you'll like it so much better than this, because it's better. When asked, because a whole lot of us in the Valley went, oi, like, what the hell? He went, oh, it's kind of a niche usage, said the man running the team. To which all the women in Silicon Valley just went, I'll give you niche, basically. It was not a good moment. And so that was one where it turns out there were no women on the team. And apparently no
Genevieve,
men.
I'm conscious
no
of the
men
time.
who knew women
And,
menstruate. Speaking of no women on the team, we're done.
we are done.
Excellent.
So it is 9:30, so join me in thanking Genevieve.
And we're out.